Hi, this video will talk about complex numbers. We'll introduce the imaginary unit, talk about how we can use the imaginary unit to simplify, and then we'll talk about how we can express expressions in standard form when we're dealing with the imaginary unit. The first rule of the imaginary unit is that we can substitute the square root of -1 with the letter I. Okay, so whenever you see the square root -1, think that that equals I. Okay, in other words, the way I think about it is when I have a negative under the radical, I can pull it out front, okay, and just make it an I. All right, and then this becomes I square root of 1 because I pull the negative out front, make it an I. And we all know the square root of 1 is just 1, so this would just be equal to I. Okay. Now, because the square root of -I equals 1, if we have I squared, okay, or in other words, we have the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, all right, anytime we have the same radical times itself, we can just pull out what's underneath. I squared is going to equal -1. I had it written as positive, but remember, I squared equals -1, okay? So whenever we end up with an I squared, okay, we can substitute in a -1. That's my two rules of the imaginary unit. So first, let's use those rules to simplify. Here, just like I was saying above, as soon as I see the negative under the radical, I'm going to pull it out front and make it an I. So this becomes I square root of 144. We all know the square root of 144 is 12. If you don't, you can use your calculator. So I can now substitute in for 144 12. So this becomes I 12. But when we deal with the imaginary unit, we typically write the number first. So I'm going to write 12. And then we write the imaginary unit second. Just like when we deal with x's, we usually write the number in front of the x. Same with the imaginary unit. In this problem, I can also use the imaginary unit to simplify. Remember, whenever we have two terms in the top and we're dividing by 1, I can simply place the denominator under everything in the numerator. So this actually equals 4 over 2 plus or minus the square root of -16 over 2. Okay, so I can just rewrite it by putting the denominator under both terms in the numerator. My first term becomes 2 because 4 divided by 2 is 2. And now I want to simplify this using my imaginary unit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, just like I said before, I'm going to move the negative out front and make it I. And this now becomes I square root 16. Okay, so my numerator becomes plus or minus I, the square root of 16 is 4, over 2. Again, it's more correct to write this as 4I. All right. So now I've got 2, and now just as if I had 4 over 2, forget the I for a second, that would become 2. So 4 over 2 becomes 2, but I've still got my I, so it becomes 2I. Now treat your I like an x, meaning you cannot combine 2 plus 2i, just like you would not combine 2 plus or minus 2x. And you'll see that as we go forward and we perform addition and subtraction with the imaginary unit. So when we're dealing with the imaginary unit and manipulating using addition and subtraction, just treat the I like an x, okay? So for example here, we would just drop the parentheses and say 3 plus I, just like we would if this was 3 plus x. And now I've got a negative out front, so I need to make sure I distribute my negative sign. So this is going to become -8, and then negative times a negative I is going to become a positive I. And now I can combine like terms, just as if I was dealing with an x and an x. So I got 3 and a -8 becomes -5. And I plus I equals 2I, just like x plus x would equal a 2x. And again, this is as simple as I can make it because I can't combine my i's with just numbers, all right? I have to have another I. Let's do another example. Here I would just drop the parentheses and get 12 minus 7i. Over here I need to distribute this negative. So I'm going to get plus 1, and now make sure you distribute to everything in parentheses, minus 9i. And now from here I can just combine like terms. I've got 12 plus 1 is 13, minus 7i minus 9i becomes minus 16i. One final note, we typically, if you have a real part, that means this part just a number, we write that first and then we write the imaginary part second. So to review, the imaginary unit comes from when we have the square root of -1, we can simply make that I. We can use that by simplifying. Whenever we have a negative under the radical, we can just pull it out front and turn it into I. And finally, we can perform addition and subtraction with the I unit just as if it were an x or some other variable. All right, and then when we simplify, we need to combine like terms only. For example, I cannot combine just a number and a number that is with I, just like I wouldn't combine a number and 2x.